Before you watch any further, there are spoilers for the first 3 ACOTAR books, so click away if you haven't read them yet. When people talk about the moral conflict in ACOTAR, I think the answer is usually good versus evil. There are clear villains in this series. Amarantha, the King of Highburn, Baron. There is cruelty, domination, abuse of power, torture, war. On the surface, ACOTAR absolutely looks like a story about good people confronting evil people, but I don't think that's the deepest moral conflict in this series. I think the deeper moral conflict in ACOTAR is necessary evil. Again and again, these characters are forced into the same sort of moral calculation. If survival, protection, love, or the greater good are on the line, what can be justified? What harm becomes permissible? What cruelty, manipulation, sacrifice, or violence can be endured or inflicted if it prevents something worse? And what makes this especially interesting to me is that the series keeps returning to the cost of these moral calculations. These aren't clean acts of heroism. Even when a choice is necessary, it leaves damage in its wake. So I don't think the real moral conflict in ACOTAR is simply good versus evil. I think it's this ongoing question of necessary evil. What can be justified? To what end? And at what price? And I think Feyre's story shows this almost immediately. One of the first real examples of necessary evil is Feyre's first experience of killing in order to feed her family, in order to survive. It's one of the earliest moments where the series introduces violence, not as hatred or domination, but as a necessity. She kills a rabbit when she is 14 years old, and this is when she becomes a hunter, and she does it in order to feed her family who is starving. Survival demands something of her. And even though that act is small compared to everything that comes later, it still matters. It changes her. It costs her something. She remembers the blood of the rabbit on her hands and the part of herself that she lost that day. That's what I think ACOTAR understands from the beginning. Necessity is never morally weightless. And the reason I think this matters so much is that the series returns to it much later, in one of the most devastating moments in the whole story, when Feyre is forced to kill 2 innocent Fae in order to save Tamlin. She thinks, the blood on my hands became the blood of that rabbit, became the blood of what I had lost. The rabbit is the first necessary evil. The innocent Fae are the unbearable expansion of the same logic. At the beginning, Feyre kills to feed her family. Under the mountain, she kills innocent people to save Tamlin, to save herself, the Spring Court, and the others who are trapped under Amarantha's reign. It's the same moral structure, but magnified to a horrifying degree. And what matters is that the series doesn't treat this as clean heroism. It doesn't present that moment as some triumphant proof of love. Instead, it shows it as a moral wound. Feyre gets through it, but it costs her something real. That's why I think necessary evil is the true moral terrain in these books. Because the characters are repeatedly pushed into situations where every available choice demands some kind of moral violation. This is one of the reasons Feyre's emotional collapse in A Court of Mist and Fury matters so much. Her suffering is not just some abstract trauma. It's the aftermath of moral compromise. She chose to do something horrific for reasons that were, in the logic of the story, necessary, and she has to live with it. One of the deepest things ACOTAR is exploring is not just, do the ends justify the means, but what does it do to a person to live by that logic? What happens when love asks something unforgivable of you? What happens when survival requires you to become the kind of person that can do such a thing? How do you live with it? Did the ends actually justify the means? I think ACOTAR is deeply interested in that aftermath. And Feyre is not the only example. Before I go on, obviously I'm as much infatuated with Rhys as everyone else. But I think he is one of the clearest embodiments of moral conflict in this story. Because so much of what Rhys does is structured around the logic of necessary evil. Under Amarantha, Rhys stays close to power by becoming complicit in terrible things. He threatens violence, he carries out some of it. He aligns himself with Amarantha enough to remain in her favor because being close to her gives him leverage. It allows him a little bit of control over the minds of those who could wreak havoc on those he loves. It lets him shield Valeris. He chooses for 50 years to protect the people he loves by sacrificing pieces of himself morally and by causing or allowing the suffering of others. That is a necessary evil calculation. And he extends that same logic in his treatment of Feyre under the mountain. He manipulates her into the bargain. He makes her drink. He forces her into a degrading public role, essentially making her play the whore in Amarantha's court. And the logic behind all of it is strategic. Keep her alive, keep his attempts to help her hidden, keep Amarantha from seeing that he cares about her, where his allegiances lie, what his weaknesses are. So he does terrible things now so that something worse doesn't happen later. Rhys is morally interesting in this way. He is not simply good, he is not simply bad. He is a character who repeatedly chooses morally compromising actions because he believes the stakes justify them. He does it to serve the greater good. And the books often frame this as a tragic necessity, which may be true. But I also think this is where the moral question in ACOTAR becomes more complicated. Because ACOTAR does not just present necessary evil as a problem for the characters. It also, in some sense, answers the problem, answers the question, makes the moral calculation. And I think it answers differently depending on the character. That's where I start to feel some tension with the books themselves. Take Tamlin and Rhys. Again, I'm on Team Rhys, but just go with me for this. I'm not saying their actions are the same. Their motives are not identical. Their relationships to Feyre are not identical, but they're both making a version of the same moral calculation. Tamlin says essentially, protection justifies control. Rhys says, essentially, protection justifies manipulation and secrecy, putting on this facade of cruelty and sometimes violence. Both characters do harmful things in the name of protecting what they love. Both characters operate under a necessary evil framework. Maybe one of the main differences is that Tamlin's version of necessary evil directly impacts Feyre, and Rhys's version of necessary evil impacts others. The series does not emotionally frame those decisions in the same way. Tamlin's protection becomes suffocating, controlling, condemnable. Rhys's protection is much more often framed as painful but justified. The burden of someone willing to do ugly things for the right reasons. And that might be fair, but I also think that the difference is not always as morally straightforward as the narrative wants it to be. That's where the real tension is for me. Not that Rhys's choices weren't necessary. Not that necessary evil wasn't actually necessary. But that the books seem to distribute sympathy unevenly. There's so much more to say on this series, but I'll leave that for another video. Until then, thank you so much for being here.